Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. I'm very pleased to be joined by Jane Toogood. Jane is the Chief Executive for the Catalyst Technologies business at Johnson Matthey. Johnson Matthey, as I'm sure most of you will know, is a very long, very well-established business, probably one of the longest established businesses I've ever spoken to, given it's over 200 years old, with a long tradition around sort of specialty chemicals and sustainable technologies. So welcome, Jane. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, good to see you.
To you. You couple your role there at Johnson Matthey with being appointed the hydrogen champion in the UK, advising the UK government on the hydrogen strategy and the rollout, and have just produced a report last month, March 2023. So a couple of things to talk about. I guess first is just to give us a little bit of your insight and your viewpoint in general. You obviously come from a sort of chemicals and polymer background, and have been in Johnson Matthey supplying sustainable technologies for a number of years. What is your sort of big picture take around hydrogen and the usage of hydrogen, production of hydrogen, etc.?
Well, that's a very broad question, of course, and as you say, I have two roles. So I have an executive role where I am CEO of the Catalyst Technologies business for Johnson Matthey, and in that business, basically, we are both licensing technology and then producing catalysts for the production of low carbon hydrogen, and also for the further production then of sustainable fuels and chemicals. I also have a role as the UK hydrogen champion. That's a separate hat that I wear. The two are separate, and I advise independently then the government and also industry on how to accelerate the transition to a hydrogen economy, where hydrogen is, of course, quite a fundamental part of how we can decarbonise the planet. So if you ask about my perspective in the long term, I mean, hydrogen is not the only answer to how we need to decarbonise. It is one part of a complex, jigsaw of solutions that we're going to need, and we're going to need to act on multiple fronts. So it is, however, a very important part of it. So from a UK perspective, there's been work by the Climate Change Committee that says that anywhere between 10 and 35% of the UK's energy requirements will be met by hydrogen by 2050. And so this is a substantive part of the energy demand for the UK that will need to be met with hydrogen, and deploying hydrogen well and transitioning into that mode is, of course, a very important part of what needs to be planned. And similar plans will exist, of course, for lots of other countries around the world today. So hydrogen has got an important role. We are going to see a growth in the demand for hydrogen, a growth in the way that hydrogen is both deployed and then traded in the future. Some of these things are going to happen in the near term, but I would say that the next decade in particular is going to see where we see widespread trading of hydrogen around the world. And then, of course, that deployment rollout will continue as we go through to 2050. If you think about how that's going to look, there have been many debates around colour of hydrogen, which I think is a very fruitless discussion, really. What we need is to decarbonise, so we need low carbon hydrogen, and we need to be as low carbon as possible. So ideally, it's electrolytic, but where you can deploy at scale with nearly 100% CO2 reduced hydrogen, you want to do that too, because we haven't got long before we need to be at scale across the world. So, I mean, those are some perspectives. Happy to explore any part of that you want, really.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of the obviously your technology bases across both, low carbon and electrolytic. I mean, the criticism around the low carbon route is that it's not 100%. What sort of percentages do you think are achievable, or should be the targets? I mean, we're talking sort of 90 plus, 95 plus. What are some of your thoughts around? Obviously, I'm not sure the definitions have been secured yet around that, but what are your thoughts around from a technology standpoint? What is achievable, and what should we be doing?
Okay. But first, let's start by what is it you want to use hydrogen for? Okay, if you're trying to decarbonise, there are three really compelling reasons why you would need hydrogen. The first is to decarbonise heavy industry that can't decarbonise any other way. Wherever possible, you'd be electrifying, but there are some things where you have a high heat intensity where you need hydrogen. The second thing can be with regard to energy balancing, particularly where you're moving towards a more renewable grid. And the third thing is as a building block to combine the sustainable carbon, okay, to then make sustainable chemicals and fuels, right, using all sorts of applications like aviation and so on. So those are the three drivers that are really going to mean you need hydrogen. Now, the aim in doing this is to decarbonise. So what you want to be doing is to have a really consistent standard for the hydrogen that you're using, the low carbon hydrogen standard. And one of the things that's going to be important is that there is a consistent standard, ideally internationally in the future. And that standard should be set as high as is practically possible, so that you get the right amount of hydrogen into the energy system, but also that you actually are decarbonising and not compromising on that decarbonisation agenda. So I think it's quite important that that standard is set at a high level, okay, at a high bar, to make sure that we've forced down the learning curve and that we do achieve the decarbonisation targets that are needed. But there's much work to do to get the standards unified across the world so that you can actually be saying that you are both producing and using hydrogen to a similar standard. So then the next question is what's available now and what can you do to meet a very low carbon hydrogen standard? Well, the JM low carbon hydrogen technology deployed with the right CCS technology basically enables a 99% capture of the CO2 that's emitted. So this is a really important step change, and it means you can produce low carbon hydrogen at scale with a very, very low level of emissions. Electrolytic hydrogen, of course, you're not producing CO2, you're actually producing hydrogen cleanly in that regard. So of course that's when you get to the 100%. And in that regard, JM have an electrolyzer, well, the CCM technology that's at the heart of the electrolyzer that enables just that. So yes, those are my views on that topic.
And I mean, that's pretty clear. And I mean, 99% is, it's effectively decarbonising. If you look at the big picture of the huge sort of role that gas plays today. In terms of the process around with your hydrogen champion hat on, I understand you went out into and spoke to a wide body of stakeholders. Was there any sort of surprising things that came out of that process, or did you glean a consensus building around usage cases, or what could you tell us about anything that you specifically learned that you weren't aware of before?
Yeah, I mean, so in my role as hydrogen champion, I have had really the fortune to talk to many stakeholders in all parts of the value chain, also to investors, and so investors, project developers, people on the production side, people who are desperate to deploy hydrogen in their facilities at scale, and also some of the smaller scale ecosystems. I think one of the things that really shone through for me, and it's quite a project when you look at how hydrogen is going to be deployed, the approach of clusters in the UK is a very strong approach, because what they're doing is combining multiple sources of demand with supply, and multiple opportunities for supply based on either renewables or CCS enabled hydrogen. And that's a really powerful combination. When you see the various hydrogen projects that exist around the world, of course you need to be matching supply and demand to make a project bankable. And I think a lot of projects generally across sort of sustainable space are really struggling with how to get that demand supply profile right. So I think what surprised me was how robust the cluster approach really was, and what I thought that was, because you're instantly reducing the risk by having multiple offtake. Having said all of that, some of the strongest projects that are out there are, of course, based on single-use offtake with the supply of hydrogen, and those will be those will work because you've got big industrial users who are, committed and compelled to decarbonise. So those sorts of projects will move forward. But I think that's an interesting angle on how this situation will evolve, really. The only other thing I would say is, and it's very obvious to many of us who are in the space, supply chains are going to become under a lot of pressure for both skills and the materials, the specific resources that you need. And so having a good view as to how you're going to work with different suppliers across the supply chain is extremely important, and how to make sure those are secured well.
Yeah,
that's going to be very interesting.
I mean, the cluster idea is I agree, very strong, and I think for me one of the big takeaways is to try and reduce the midstream, because obviously hydrogen is it's volumetric, it's difficult to transport. So if you can try and minimize that initially, I guess for the initial decade, you can begin to reduce the costs on the production side, and indeed open up the usage cases without taking on too much midstream costs. And one other question, I guess, just around policy. You sit with you run a business. You're very commercial. You're advising the government. The government's role, I guess, within the energy transition is to come up with what I call investment grade policy. The UK stands a little bit alone, and I guess can look at what's happening in Europe with the Refuel EU, and I guess some of the compliance approach, which some would call the stick approach, and the Americans, which with the IRA, which is maybe a bit more of a carrot approach, subsidies. What do you, and yeah, clearly there's a way to do both, and to try and stimulate production as well as stimulate demand. How do you sit around that sort of policy piece, and is there a sweet spot where you're trying to combine the both sort of stick and carrot approach?
So I mean, look, I'm an advisor. I don't set the policy.
Yeah.
So I think probably best off speaking to somebody from government themselves to talk about that. I mean, you've just described, though, quite nicely, there are very many different approaches to this. There are many different ways to get after this. And you see this very strong incentivized approach in the US, and then a different approach, of course, in Europe, but not completely different. And I think what's exciting is that everybody is moving. Now, actually, that's what we need. We need it. We need things to move, and it may be that policy is most appropriate, is different in different ecosystems, basically, based on perhaps the natural geological advantage, based on perhaps the current fiscal frameworks, etc., etc. And I think that's fine, to be perfectly honest. It doesn't need to be a competition per se. What we need is to move forward on multiple fronts, and each project typically stands on its own 2 feet anyway with regard to bankability. So as long as policy is moving, and I think in that regard, IRA has been a great development to drive change, as has the steps that have been taken by the EU and the UK to both provide certainty and visibility around investments and how this will work. I think that's all good. The biggest thing is as much visibility, as much certainty over an extended period. That's what investors really need to get into the space. So that's what I would advocate for. As I say, context is probably different from place to place.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess long time horizons are essentially critical for what are large capital investments with obviously the long payback. And what other risks do you see that need to be minimized in the projects?
If I were thinking about this, when you're putting together these projects, you need to know that you've got great technology at the heart of it. Okay. This is where JM's got an important role to play, because JM's got this very strong technology for low carbon hydrogen, very strong technology for CCMs, very efficient and selected for various projects, etc. So that takes out some of the risk associated with that. The actual project developers themselves will have experience. That takes out that risk of experience there. What you don't want is any policy uncertainty on top. So by working with very well-reputed technology and solutions providers. You can take out a bunch of the risk. All you need to do now is to make sure the policy frameworks within that you're looking to deploy are also sitting in a consistent and cohesive framework going forward. So I would advocate always that's there, that certainty and visibility as much as possible.
And what do you think around that? I mean, the scaling up and how we're going to do that. So I've been quite surprised with some of the scales of the projects that are being proposed. There seems to be a huge leap, and it doesn't seem to be very small steps in order to sort of prove the technology at a steady state. We're certainly leaping into major sort of gigawatt scale. Do you think what are your thoughts around that? Is the technology ready? Are we really going to be able to deploy at such enormous scale in within the next decade?
That's a great question, actually. And if I think about the technology, I mean, for low carbon hydrogen, CCNS enabled, you basically have technology that's ready. There's not that it needs further evolution. The technology is there. It's already being licensed. We're licensing. We've publicised those licenses, and that can be deployed right now. So it's not that it's a question of needing to be further evolved. For electrolytic hydrogen, of course, there is, again, technology that's there, which doesn't mean to say there won't be learning. I think the learning is going to come there around that sort of scale industrialization, as, for example, PEM electrolytic hydrogen technology is deployed at scale globally. There will be learnings around industrialization. JM is very much at the forefront of making sure that we're driving those learnings in the way that that's being deployed. So a lot of the challenge of scale up is one of both industrialization, where it comes to electrolytic hydrogen. There'll also be something there about the critical resources and having access to critical resources, and making sure that we recycle or we use any critical resources will be, of course, an important part of this going forward. It's going to be quite a journey as we scale this industry across the world now, with quite some competition, I suspect, to be there with the most reliable suppliers.
Yeah, yeah, excellent. I can certainly see that happening. So yeah, in terms of the scale up, do you see a lot of scale up happening, I guess, in house? Is it a question of Johnson Matthey's ability to build bigger manufacturing plants and be able to scale costs, in your factories, or is it also around see the scale of projects?
So I think it's both, actually. The
Yeah.
projects themselves, of course, that are being deployed are the scale is growing all the time, actually. So a large project now is hundreds of megawatts, not just a few, tens of megawatts, which is great. Although very limited evidence of those just yet. So that's quite an important piece. And then for ourselves, we're building gigawatt factories, and we've publicised that too. We've embarked on a partnership with Plug Power in the US in the electrolytic side. So yes, that's very much about the sort of scale up of our own capabilities, again, to meet the scale as it comes towards us. So yes, it's on all fronts.
Excellent. Well, many thanks for speaking to us today. I look forward to learning more and seeing Johnson Matthey helping to develop the industry as we go forward. Many thanks.
Thanks very much, Nadine. Looking forward to the event.
Cheers. Perfect. That's clear and concise. Many thanks, Jane, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to share your thoughts and your particular viewpoint. It's been interesting to talk to you, and we look forward to working with Johnson Matthey going forward across all of our sort of multiple events and trying to accelerate the clean hydrogen industry in its various forms and in many markets and many usage cases that I'm sure are going to become ever more relevant as we go into the next decade. So many thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Nadine.
Cheers. Take care. Many thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Take
Bye.
care.